So I draw your attention to the second chapter of the first book of Aristotle's On Rhetoric, which can be found on around page 40. This is in the Kennedy version of the text that we are using, and it starts on number 8 here, page 40, number 8. In the case of persuasion through proving or seeming to prove something, that's where I'm focused right now. So what Aristotle is doing here is he's talking about sort of the distinctions between rhetoric and dialectic. Just think of philosophy for stand-in for dialectic. So, there's lots of overlap between rhetoric and philosophy, or rhetoric and dialectic, and he's sort of making some distinctions here. And he's doing that by talking about the enthymeme and the syllogism. Where things get really murky, I think, is he calls the enthymeme a rhetorical syllogism. It's like, what is that, right? So here's how I'd like to sort of walk through this. You've got the enthymeme, which for Aristotle is the kind of the main argumentative medium, strategy, sort of the means by which we attempt to persuade others, is this business of the enthymeme. We'll get it back into that. And then in philosophy or dialectic, we often talk about syllogism. So what's the difference here? All right, so in philosophy, dialectic, the way to think about sort of the syllogism is, if you've read any of Plato's dialogues, it's usually just like one or two characters talking back and forth, question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. And they start off with these big questions, right? Like, what is the difference between the pleasurable and the good? Wow, right? Like, that's a big question. It's a big abstract question. And the dialectical process is question, response, question, back and forth. And so you can engage in dialectical inquiry just sort of between two people or a small group of people sitting around a table, right? But the point is that it's this really sort of deep, abstract investigation into sort of big, broad truths, philosophical truths. And if we come up with these big, broad sort of certainties, like the good is that which benefits others. I don't know, just made that up. Versus the pleasurable, which is that which benefits the self and it's temporary or something like that. Just made that off the top of my head, but let's just go with it and say that that's the definition of the good and that's the definition of the pleasurable. You can think of those sort of definitions as these major statements or principles or almost like laws, right? And you can walk around then and you can say, based on this definition of what's good, I can look at this situation and I can say good, bad, or whatever. That is a deductive process, right? And what you're doing is you're starting from a big statement, right? The good is blank, or the pleasurable is blank, or war is blank, or love is blank, parenting is blank, teaching is blank, travel is blank, whatever, right? So the idea of philosophical dialectical inquiry is to come up with these big, certain truths, right? And this is the very Platonic kind of project, is to come up with these big, rigid, absolute certainties. And then once you have these things, you can walk into any situation, you can say, I know what that is because I'm operating from these big definitions, right? So that is syllogistic deductive reasoning, starting from a big, certain premise and then deducing based on a situation, right? And there's an allure to this because of that certainty business, right? If I have in my brain or in my breast some ironclad notion of what it means to be a vegan, right, or whatever, then I can walk into any situation and sort of apply that certain knowledge, and life is easy. Now, what Aristotle says about the enthymeme is sort of similar to but different than what I just talked about. All right, so he calls the enthymeme a rhetorical syllogism. Now, what does that mean? Well, he says also in this chapter here, this page, he says, so he says, just as in dialectic there is on the one hand induction and on the other hand the syllogism, and the apparent syllogism, or that's the fallacious syllogism, so the situation is similar in rhetoric. For the paradigm or the example is an induction, and the enthymeme a syllogism. I want to focus on just that one line right there. The paradigm or an example is an induction, the enthymeme a syllogism. So I think this makes some sense, right? If you've ever traveled, maybe you went to Italy and you ended up, I had this experience with my wife a few years ago. We went to Italy, we encountered some like shady people, and now she's like, I don't know if I like Italy, right? Based on a small sample or a small experience, a local tiny kind of isolated example, you broaden, right? So that's induction, is to work from the small to the general. From the immediate experience to the general kind of reality, right? Deduction works the opposite. It works from the broad principle down to the local experience. So to deduce is to take a principle and apply it to a local situation. To induce is to take a local situation and draw a principle out of it, right? You go to Canada, where I'm from, you meet 4 nice people, and you say, wow, based on my personal experience, I would say all Canadians are friendly, right? So that's an inductive move, is to say, based on this experience, small, local, discrete, we can draw out these broader conclusions. So the induction, so the example is a form of induction. But the business of the enthymeme as a form of deduction takes us into this kind of murky realm of the rhetorical syllogism, right? So when you think of the enthymeme, you still want to be thinking about deduction, just like the syllogism. The syllogism deduces from a big, broad, certain principle to a local example. The rhetorical syllogism also deduces from some kind of premise to a particular example. Here's the key difference. With the syllogism, the dialectical syllogism, you're starting from an abstract principle, right? You're dealing with morality oftentimes, big moral principles. All blank are blank. All acts of goodness are sacrificial, right? That's a big, broad statement. Abstract, philosophical, moral. Right, and so the goal is to be universal with the syllogism, whereas the enthymeme is not interested in big abstract ideas. The enthymeme is rhetorical, which means that it's dealing with concrete, pragmatic, worldly situations, right? But the key insight here is that we can still deduce. Deduce from what? Well, not from certainties, not from certain truths, like with the syllogism, probable truths. This is the key idea, gang. Probabilities in Aristotle are everything. When you read through those selections, you'll see he uses phrases like, for the most part, generally speaking, that which can be relied on in the greater number of cases. He uses this language of probability everywhere. And for Aristotle, the whole game of rhetoric is to operate in probabilities and with probabilities, right? So if I walk into a speech sort of situation and somehow I discern that half of the audience members are Canadian, I can make a joke and say, oh, at least I know half of you are nice. What's happening there is I'm deducing, here's a local situation, right? I am deducing based on an assumption about the niceness of Canadians, but I'm still deducing. I'm deducing from an assumption or a premise about the niceness of Canadians that is not 100% true. I lived in Canada. I was born in Canada. I lived there for 24 years, and then I moved to Illinois to get my PhD. And I can tell you that there are a-holes in Canada. There are weirdos in Canada. There are really boring people in Canada. I can also tell you that, for the most part, Canadians are pretty dang nice. Right? So in terms of probabilities, you're in pretty decent shape if you assume that Canadians are nice, but not always, not 100%. The enthymeme is a rhetorical syllogism because it deduces from probabilities, not things that are 100% true, but things that are reliably true, like the niceness of Canadians, right? So what's genius about Aristotle's sort of treatment of the enthymeme is that you can find it operating in any attempt to influence, persuade between one person and an audience or a group or even another person or whatever by drawing on assumptions about what the audience believes or actually is, right? But none of these assumptions that we're drawing on are 100% certain. What in our social lives, our public lives, the stuff that we debate about on a daily basis, what percentage of that stuff actually we can sort of draw on absolute certainties? Most of the controversies that we engage in are controversies because there is no 100% on either side, right? And even though the sides might think they're 100% all this or all that, the truth is more generally in the middle, in that kind of probabilistic middle part, right? So things are not 100% true, they're 72% true, or they're 44% true, or they're 61% true, or whatever. We're always talking about spectrums here, right? But the business of rhetoric for Aristotle, the business of reasoning and arguing, is the business of drawing on these probable assumptions in order to persuade an audience, right? So I still remember when Dick Cheney was, back when George W. Bush was campaigning for his second term, and I still remember to this day a speech that Dick Cheney, Vice President Dick Cheney, movie was made about him recently, he was giving a speech in front of an audience, and this was an audience of mostly like conservative Republicans, so it's a familiar audience to the Vice President. And I'll never forget, he said, don't forget they were going up against John Kerry. You might remember Senator John Kerry, very wealthy senator. He'd been a Vietnam hero, but he was perceived as being sort of out of touch because he married a woman who was like a super gazillionaire, the Heinz ketchup heiress, right? And so what Cheney was doing is drawing on assumptions about Democrats as being soft on terror, right? Because Democrats and the left are very nice and very welcoming and inclusive, and they don't like to be hard and so on, right? So knowing this, Dick Cheney said to his audience, we absolutely need to re-elect George W. Bush for a second term, because if we don't, there's a very good chance that we're going to get hit again. We, meaning America, and hit meaning 9/11, right? If we don't elect John Kerry, there's a good chance that we are going to get hit again. The thing about the Enthymeme is what it doesn't say, right? It doesn't say it because it doesn't need to be said. It's drawing on assumptions of the audience. Now, what Cheney was drawing on was an assumption about Democrats or the left as being soft on terror, weak. This is an old trope on the right, right? The right is like, we love the military and strength, and the left is like, weak, too loving and too inclusive, right? So he was drawing on these assumptions to make this argument that if we elect Kerry, we're going to get attacked by terrorists. Now, there's a lot of stuff that needs to get filled in there, right? That Kerry is a soft, national security, soft Democrat, that Democrats are weak and they don't have what it takes, and so on and so on. He didn't have to say all of that stuff. It was just known. It was assumed, right? So the way I think about enthymemes is like going fishing, right? I don't know for certain if the audience is going to believe this or accept this, but I'm pretty sure. Like whenever I'm giving a class and, it starts getting like super dead and people are falling asleep, start talking about pop culture, start talking about movies, start talking about, stuff that the audience is going to react to or relate to, right? And it always works. So you're basing your appeals, this is all rhetoric's job for Aristotle, is like creating appeals. You're going fishing. Will this work? What if I try this? What about this assumption? If I say this, how will they respond, right? And in doing so, you're attempting to tap into assumptions. And in doing that, you are engaging your audience, right? You actually are sort of needing them to sort of, oftentimes the way the enthymeme is described is that the hearer supplies the missing premise. I think that's actually straight out of Aristotle. The hearer supplies the missing premise, right? In the sense that, like, I don't have to say it. I can just sort of tip it off, and you fill in the blank with your own attitudes about whatever it is we're talking about, right? This is the realm of the probable. Not the certain, the more or less reliable. That's it. That's the game of persuasion for Aristotle. And that's the function of enthymemes for Aristotle, is to deduce based on some assumption about what is likely, right? In Cheney's case, it was almost certain that if he said something along the lines of Democrats are weak, Kerry is soft, that audience was going to go, yep, hell yeah, let's get another 4 years of George Bush, right? And sure enough, that worked, right? So he's making a guess, but it's an educated guess about what the audience is likely to accept, likely to agree with, likely to kind of share, right? And so it's a really, really powerful concept, I think, because you really can't persuade an audience without some understanding of how enthymemes, you can't persuade an audience without using enthymemes. And you can't really understand the business of persuasion without understanding how enthymemes work. But basically, we're dealing with the realm of the probable. We're dealing with deductions from certain assumptions about what we're talking about and what we think the audience believes or can accept, right? And we are inventing our arguments based on all of this. So when Aristotle talks about invention as artistic proof is I have artistic license. As speaker, I have some creative control over what I choose to say, touch on, invoke, right? So I'm creating this video a day or two after Trump's rally where he was like, send him back, right? That whole send him back thing. Highly enthymematic in the sense that he's tapping into assumptions about the congresswomen that he was talking about. Right, wrong, true, false, doesn't really matter, rhetorically speaking, so much as the fact that he's able to. Trump is a rhetorical genius because he knows that he can go to these I refer to them as fishing holes, right? It's like there's some fish there. He can go to the fishing hole and he can like throw in his hook and he can start saying, send them back or whatever he said where that gets the crowd chanting and, lock her up or whatever, right? He's tapping into shared assumptions. That's enthymematic. That's him knowing his audience. That's him sort of giving the audience sort of what they want, and it's him advancing his agenda by hooking into the audience's assumptions. All of that is enthymematic, okay? All of it is inventional. All of it is artistic. And that's the main thing, right? So I just wanted to kind of hit on these ideas because they're super core to like everything else that Aristotle's up to, right? So let me see if I can try one more time to just bring it in. We've got enthymemes, we've got syllogisms, and again, Aristotle calls the enthymeme a rhetorical syllogism. He calls it that to distinguish it from induction, right? Induction works from an example to the broad. Deduction works from the broad down to the example. The key move here is not to distinguish the enthymeme from deduction. The enthymeme is deductive. The crucial part is to understand what it is deducing from. One more example, or a sort of a hypothetical. Imagine a scenario where you have a workplace and you have like assistant managers, like let's say there's 5 or 6 of them, like senior employees, right? Of those senior employees, let's say one of them is known to like never volunteer when there's like, hey, we need someone to head up this new initiative. Hey, we need someone to like get a team together and go do da-da-da-da. And there's one employee W, let's say, never steps up, never does their share, is just very content to kind of hang back and whatever, right? Now imagine a scenario where like the regional supervisor gets in touch with the office and says, hey gang, I need someone to head up this new project. And of the remaining, 5, let's say 3 of them are like, sorry, I'm too busy, I'm out of town, da-da-da. So one of the remaining employees says, well, I guess that means I'm doing it. This is an abstract example that came to me a few years ago, somewhat based on real experience. But like, okay, so everyone else would love to do it, but they're not unable to do it. Colleague W is able to do it, but we know that that person won't. So the final person who's able to do it says, well, I guess it means me then. And what's embedded in that statement is an assumption about colleague W, who we know will never offer. So there's a certain deduction here that the broad statement is colleague W will not offer to do it. Therefore, I guess I'm doing it. You know what I mean? And so what's that? The last little tweak here is, what is that statement based on? It's based on actual, real-world, empirical experience, data, real empirical data, right? So if your colleague is known over the course of years and years, like never offers, never says, I'll do it, never takes it on, at a certain point, the truth about that person is that they're not going to offer. They're not going to volunteer. That's the rhetorical, probable statement. That is the probable statement that you're operating from. It's not 100% true. It's not that that colleague will never offer, but based on experience, based on everything we've seen, what we've witnessed, what we've observed, what we know to be true, there's no chance that that colleague is going to offer to take on that project. So the last remaining worker says, well, I guess I'm doing it then. Don't have to say the missing premise, which is because colleague W will never offer. It's understood. The rest of the audience fills in the blank and they go, yeah, colleague W will never offer, so I guess you're doing it. Now, you don't have to say it. It's understood. It's understood that there's a truth that's operating. It's not 100% true, but it's more or less true. It's more or less true that colleague W is not going to offer. So why bother? Why bother going through the motion of like asking and being told, no, I can't, whatever, right? So there's a final twist. Our probabilistic statements that we deduced from come to us from actual lived reality, not some higher source. Rhetoric is concerned with everydayness. It's concerned with this world, this life, history as it's actually unfolded, right? Things as they actually are, good, bad, right, wrong, pretty, ugly, whatever. It deals with the here and the now and things as they are. And so enthymemes are deducing from things as they are in that probabilistic sense that we can sort of rely more or less that the audience will accept this and that they will agree, and that's how you persuade. So hopefully that helps finesse a little bit some of the stuff that I get into in the older video, but I don't really sort of dive as deep in there as I think we probably should at this point for understanding the paper and understanding the real kind of nub, I think, of what Aristotle's up to in terms of his understandings of persuasion, his understanding of audiences, his understanding of this question of invention and rhetorical artistry, and this business of knowledge. It's not certain. It's not absolute for Aristotle. For Aristotle, it is probabilistic. We can't know things. We can know some things scientifically, we can know some things sort of philosophically, but in terms of our everyday sort of conducting our lives, going about our business, it's the realm of the probable. It generally is, and especially in the realm of the public, in terms of controversies, in terms of debates, in terms of, issues that arise and we have to kind of figure out what to do. That's the realm of the probable. And so we influence and persuade one another enthymematically, drawing on these assumptions about what the audience might accept or what is true and real and so on. And that's the whole game of rhetoric for Aristotle, and I hope this helps clarify and maybe open up the ideas a little bit more and helps get you thinking about what's going on. The speech that I posted for the assignment is this really engaging, powerful speech by Emma Gonzalez after the Parkland school shooting from, I think it was last year. And so that's what you're going to be asked to kind of to read and view and use Aristotle's insights to try to talk about what she's doing and more importantly, how she's doing it. Okay, so hopefully this is helpful, and hope all's well otherwise, and I'll see you on the boards, gang.